What do you do when a minister refuses to meet with you or refuses to discuss items of importance and subsequently the administration of that department applies pressure and utilize tactics that restrict your ability to do the job for which you were hired? And to add insult to injury, take a personal attack position. In what world does it make sense when the entity you are tasked to oversee in regards to fairness has total control over the tools you need to do the job? Furthermore, they have in its current structure the ability to investigate the office. When someone at the top of an organization is the problem, how does a $7 million organization repel the force of a $20 billion one? During my mandate, I witnessed a significant decline in the quality of responses that I received to the evidence-based recommendations. A great deal of these recommendations remain unimplemented 7 to 10 years later. Warnings issued to the Minister of National Defence and senior civilian and military leadership on various matters, which, if they had been addressed, would have helped mitigate issues before they spun out of control. Scrolling through the letters sent by all ombudsmen, myself included, over the years and reviewing the ministerial and departmental responses, it would be comical if it weren't so tragic. So many of these issues that the CAF are now grappling with had previously been identified with urgency years ago. The common pattern was as follows. Ombudsman warns via letter. Minister and department responds casually or not at all. Ombudsman warns yet again. Same reaction. Ombudsman launches investigation, makes recommendations. Issues make national headlines. Minister and department both react quickly, accept all recommendations, but sadly rarely implement. That is why the concerns raised by the Ombudsman's office, in my opinion, are of national importance. The office is like a canary in the coal mine. If the Minister of National Defence and the government of the day do nothing with the concern raised by the office, then having the office report to Parliament would help ensure that these concerns are visible and appropriately addressed. The office's budget and authorities would be free of petty power squabbles, and the business of ensuring those in the defence community are treated fairly, regardless of who's in charge. 26 years of asking by all ombudspersons, documented cases of interference, issues of not addressing and not implementing recommendations, personal attacks, pettiness, and the agendas that never get us to the core of doing the right thing, leave us to where we find ourselves today. Is there a better path? Can we create one? Can we give the D&D CAF the same right as we afford incarcerated individuals in this country? A legislated body free of vindictive and petty behaviour that helps no one. These issues are of national importance and impact national security. Don't let this opportunity slip away yet again. Thank you.
Mr. White, 5 minutes, please.
In November 2022, I provided the Access Information, Privacy and Ethics Committee with examples of how the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defence abuse the access to information and privacy systems and deny victims of sexual misconduct the critical information they need to seek justice. I became familiar with CAF D&D abuses of the ATIP system and their reprisals against whistleblowers through fighting an ongoing 5.5-year battle for accountability against the Royal Canadian Navy's chain of command to see justice done against a serial sexual misconduct offender known as Officer X and the leadership who are covering up for him. For context, here it is. In 2018, instead of supporting victims and witnesses of Officer X's serial sexual misconduct, the chain of command of my former Naval Reserve unit, quote, interrogated victims and witnesses under caution with allegations of mutiny and treason, unquote. These threats of high-order criminal charges were made against those considering reporting Officer X in order to silence and intimidate them. In other words, mutiny and treason for reporting crimes and inappropriate behavior. When the military police found enough evidence to support a charge of sexual assault against Officer X in response to my complaint, the commanding officer decided the appropriate response was, quote, divisional interview and mentorship, unquote. There is no evidence that this substantively inappropriate decision has ever been questioned by anyone in the entire Royal Canadian Navy chain of command. In response to me raising concerns, the same commanding officer sent defamatory emails to the Naval Reserve headquarters to discredit my complaint against Officer X, questioning the timing and implying it was false or made in bad faith. The command team then leveraged personal relationships with Naval Reserve headquarters personnel to create the false narrative that victims and witnesses of Officer X's serial sexual misconduct were, quote, trying to influence a police investigation that was underway at that time by organizing a parallel justice system, unquote. The influence and parallel justice system referred to was the encouragement of others to report sexual assault and sexual harassment through the established system. I provided a summary of the sexual misconduct suspicions against Officer X and forced the Naval Reserve Headquarters to conduct its own internal investigation, which confirmed, quote, all the individuals brought forth allegations that were bundled up with 14 years of multiple allegations and military police investigations against Officer X that had resulted in zero action, unquote. My founded harassment complaint of abuse of power against the unit coxswain who interrogated myself and others resulted in only minor private consequences while he was publicly celebrated. Commodore Pat Montgomery, Commander Naval Reserve and Camosun College professor, and Captain Navy Richard Jean, Naval Reserve Deputy Commander, then dismissed complaints against the commanding officer and then executive officer and staff officer, relying excessively on procedural technicalities and timelines, stating, quote, there exists no evidence that reprisals would have followed in the event of submitting harassment complaints against the CO and XO, unquote. It is genuinely concerning that Commodore Montgomery and Captain Navy Jean decided no evidence exists without even having conducted an investigation, while each had full knowledge of the defamatory emails. I raised my concerns about the Naval Reserve with Rear Admiral Christopher Robinson, Commander Maritime Forces Pacific, who in the face of all of the foregoing concluded, quote, you have been treated fairly, unquote. In October 2023, Vice Admiral Angus Topshee, Commander Royal Canadian Navy, was confronted at a public event by a concerned citizen and directly made aware of these issues. Despite his personal assurance and signature on the page promising to investigate, nearly 6 months later, there has not been one single update or follow-up meeting scheduled. It does not seem to concern the Navy that the commanding officer who made the mentorship decision is listed as an involved person on page 3 of the very same police report into which he acted as a charge-laying authority and failed to recuse himself. And Mr. Chair, I'll take this moment to state that I understand my previous request for extra time was rejected, but I wonder, in light of what I've said so far and with the preview that the worst is yet to come, I could have 2 more minutes to finish my remarks.
Up to the committee. Agreed? Yes, sir. Yeah.
All of the facts that I have provided are written in the CAF's own reports. Military police investigation into sexual assault, founded. Harassment investigation into abuse of power, founded. Privacy breach investigation, founded. Internal investigation into Officer X's 14-year history of sexual misconduct against multiple victims, founded. To the best of my knowledge, Officer X and all members of the chain of command are still serving in the Royal Canadian Navy, and not one has faced any disciplinary consequences for their actions. In fact, the executive officer has since been promoted and is the current commanding officer of a Naval Reserve Division. He is also personally responsible for a founded breach of the Privacy Act. It gets worse. Most of the members in this case are part-time reservists and have full-time civilian occupations in your communities. This also means that there is potential risk to members of the public. As I reported directly to Commodore Montgomery in April and May 2023, the coxswain who threatened charges against myself and others carries police authority in his civilian job. And the former CO who decided mentorship was an appropriate punishment for sexual assault, and Officer X, responsible for over 14 years of sexual misconduct, are each employed full-time with direct supervisory authority over children. To conclude, I've relied heavily on the broken and inadequate access to information and privacy systems to fight for the critical information I have shared today. After 5.5 years, one message is clear. The Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defence is anything but transparent. There is no justice without accountability, and there is no accountability without transparency. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. White. Go to our 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. So we noted in your testimony before the Access to Information Privacy and Ethics Committee about the ATIP system. Could you summarize your concerns with the ATIP system?
To respond to that, I'd separate them both into the Access to Information System and the privacy system. The Access to Information System is easily defeatable on the basis of the fact that it relies on an honor system. As we heard testimony from the deputy minister, there's no standard procedure under which different groups across the department are required to respond. And so there's ripe opportunity for abuse where records can be withheld, deleted, and very little accountability. In terms of the privacy system, a significant barrier and challenge I'll highlight is that you are required to name the individual record holder in trying to get access to your personal information. So as an example, I would welcome any member of this committee who could name the individual CRA, Canada Revenue Agency employee who helped process your tax return, to know whether you could get information on that under the Privacy Act. Because I can tell you, a victim of sexual misconduct does not have information about the totality of the headquarters and who's involved in their files.
You've indicated that you've been the victim of privacy breach on your first. You said it perhaps 2 breaches. In your first breach, can you describe how this happened? How you became aware that this?
The first breach happened when I submitted a harassment complaint, and I ATIP'd the response because unfortunately Commodore Montgomery didn't think that it would be appropriate to give me the final decision in one harassment investigation. In this one, against the executive officer I mentioned, the privacy breach happened because the individual improperly retained access and shared personal information that should have been transferred when I transferred units or destroyed. I had to then ATIP the package that confirmed that. I made a complaint with the appropriate group at the Directorate of Access to Information and Privacy. And regrettably, I'm looking at their recommendation, and unfortunately it was one that said that they didn't feel that they needed to take any action because the system under which the information would stored has changed. So to the comments that have been made by the minister and the deputy, there are no consequences for breach.
So in the course of making an access request, did you get the information you requested?
I got the information I requested. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 approaches or kicks at the can.
Okay, but they violated your privacy in so doing.
One of the documents that was released in the release package was an email that had attached my personal information that was circulated internally, and that's how I knew there was a breach.
Wow.
What concerns me about that, sir, I'll also add, is the individuals who sent it and the individual who received my information had all the requisite training, knowledge, and experience as former commanding officers, and in this case now a current commanding officer, that they should have known better.
Okay. If I understood your opening statement correctly, are you saying that the military police that investigated you were actually had a connection to the complaint itself?
Not the military police. So what happens is that under the old system that has since changed, but it did apply to my case of sexual misconduct, commanding officers had to lay charges. In other words, the military police had to refer the files back to the units in order to have a charge-laying decision. As I've raised concerns, this individual, the commanding officer who made the charge-laying decision, which is part of the justice process, was not only present at the event, he is a friend of the accused, or a perceived friend, and has known him for a long time. And so this is a very clear conflict of interest that not one member in the entire Royal Canadian Navy chain of command apparently was able to read to page 3 of the report.
So how would you describe transparency in the MP reporting system?
It's very difficult. First of all, complainants are not automatically given a copy of their police reports. In fact, I believe there's a box that the military police can check that says complainant not notified. I truly struggle to understand why that box is allowed to exist.
So how does a complainant access a copy of...
First of all, you would have to find out that the report has concluded, and you don't always get that unless you follow up with the police. Then you would have to go through the access to information system itself to make the request. I believe it took a significant amount of time, maybe up to 6 months, a year, for me to be able to get that. And I'd like to point out that one of the things that's very difficult about that is in order to make a complaint with the Military Police Complaints Commission, you have 1 year from the conclusion of an investigation. So if there is a delay in receiving a copy of that report that pushes you outside the 1 year time limit, you actually have to get discretionary approval for the Military Police Complaints Commission to investigate.
Okay, but all the way along, you're having to use the access to information system to get the information that you need to make a proper complaint.
100%.
And delay is endemic in would you say in the access to information
Absolutely.
system? What kinds do you get feedback or reasons why they won't give you the information?
Sometimes you do get an occasional response from the department saying that they're going to exceed the time limit. I know that an article came out recently saying that they weren't doing that. They started doing that. They've now stopped doing that again. I often follow up with them via email because I know that attempting to resolve the problem is a prerequisite of going to the Information Commissioner or Privacy Commissioner. But let me say that complaining to the Information and Privacy Commissioner is not an exception to getting the information. It is part of the process. You will not get your information unless you make a complaint.
Ellie? Mr. Fisher, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Naval Lieutenant White, thank you for being here and sharing your story. Thank you for your service, your continued service to your country. Mr. Walburn, Gary, nice to see you again. We've had many conversations over the last several years. I can't believe it's been 6 years that you've been gone from the position of Ombudsman. And I'm glad to hear that you are enjoying retirement in Prince Edward Island on your farm, cleaning up the damage from Fiona. So, Gary, you've had 6 years, and you touched on some of this perhaps in your opening 5 minutes, but upon reflection, I'm wondering if you could, and this is probably revisiting an awful lot of the things that you've said to this committee and said to individuals around the table in the past, but what tools or supports would have enabled you to better fulfill your duties in your time as an ombudsman? Again, I know you've touched on some of these individually, but I'd like to get these on the record.
Well, the two areas of restriction that really bear down on the Ombudsman's office is the one of financial control and the other one is human resource control. It got to a point of, I call it was just ludicrous behavior. It got to a point where I wanted to travel as the Ombudsman, and I had to get approval to do that. And it would be things along the lines, okay, could you submit your claim, and could you make it do the factoring 4 places beyond the decimal point? It just got to be such a laborious process to go through to get anything done. We once wanted to staff a position, and we determined the attributes and the assets that person needed. And then when we sent it to the department for posting, because they have the authority, they changed what we had put on the bulletin. So it changed the type of individual that they were recruiting, not what we were recruiting. So it's just having those things just always in someone else's hands were really restrictive to the ombudsman doing his job.
I remember meeting with you one time in Center Block, and as frustrated as you were very clearly very proud of some of the work that you were able to get done, things you were able to accomplish on behalf of individual members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Can you talk a little bit about some of the successes, some of the things that you were able to accomplish as ombudsman? Because, as frustrated as you were at the time, you had some major successes, and you were very proud of some of the work that was done.
I think a lot of what the Ombudsman does goes unsung. We don't see everything. We handled, during my tenure, I was there for 4.5 years, we handled approximately 10,000 personal cases with 100% success rate of getting those people to where they wanted to be. I think that's the bread and butter of what an Ombudsman does day to day. I think we issued 14 reports in 4.5 years, and there were untold number of recommendations made. Though I'm disappointed they all haven't been implemented. There's been some work towards most of them. Retaining the member, which was something we were very proud of. They weren't going to release a member till all benefits and services were in place from all sources. Now I see that starting to slip. We're starting to release members again before having them prepared for what Civvy Street looks like. So I think we made some great strides while I was there. We raised some very good points about the Reserve Force. We did several reports on the Reserve Force that hadn't been done before and opened up access to some benefits for them. We met with the Rangers in the North, and something as simple as putting a report out in their language was so receptive for them. Valcartier, I'm very, very proud of the Valcartier report and the benefits that came out of that. So I think there was a lot that we accomplished, but I will go back to say that what we did on a day-to-day basis, the actual, I'll call it grunt work on the ground, when we were there face-to-face, on the bases, meeting people, listening to, the widows, I think it was tremendous work. But it's very, I used to enjoy getting out of Ottawa, let me tell you. I still enjoy it, I have to tell you. I enjoyed getting out of Ottawa and talking to the people because the Canadian Armed Forces, the men and women who make the Canadian Armed Forces, they're unsung heroes every day. These people get up and do their best. They come to work and they do the job that Canada asks them to do. And that's where the real truth laid. And I think that's where we made a lot of headway. We built a lot of trust with that community, and we really got some engagement.
I'm not sure how much time I have. 1 minute. I'll just finish off, Gary, by saying that you were and made yourself available to us, not only as committee members, but as members of Parliament on a regular basis. And I can remember how flexible you were when we were trying to meet with you, and I wanted to thank you personally for that. I know we met several times, and I learned an awful lot from you, and I'm very thankful for the work that you did. Thank you.
I think it's a part of the Ombudsman's role is to make sure he's educating the community, all communities, about what's going on and how, seek that help and input and assistance to help move the portfolio forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the witnesses for their attendance here. I have a first question that you may both be able to answer. You may not be able to answer, however. I'm hearing from military colleagues that access to cases or files for a military member is actually easy once you have the security clearance you need within Defense, the Department of Defense. But when you have access to a member's file, there is no way to track who had access to that file, nor any notes. So anyone can touch or have a look at it without the individual being aware. In the healthcare sector, if someone looks at our case file, then there is something in the case file that shows it. Is this something that sounds familiar to you?
It's for me, or
Either of us, if you'd like.
I think access, I'll give it to you.
When it comes to a lot of the case in information, I appreciate the highlight of the struggle. One of them I can tell you related to the grievance file is exactly that. One of the first steps when you file a grievance is that they give you a consent form that gives the department permission to access everything about you. They don't necessarily tell you who's accessing it, what the totality of things that they consider are. I understand that members could then ATIP, again, factor in. Anytime I say ATIP, remember there's a delay involved there. ATIP their grievance file to see what's in it, and that's what is supposed to be the totality of what's considered. So if something's missing from the grievance file, members would have an ability to say, well, no, I'm adding in additional documentation. But I will say that since the recent article about Officer X in the newspaper, I've been receiving anonymous harassing emails from someone who claims to be associated with National Defense Headquarters. And I've asked my chain of command to look in who may have accessed my personal email, because it's coming to my personal email. And they don't even seem to be able to tell me who's been pulling up my file and what's accessed it. So I would certainly hope they'd be able to do that, because if there's a group of people you would expect to have accessed my folder, and then someone who very clearly I don't know and may not have any reason to have accessed it, but did, I'd say the military police owes them a visit.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que je comprends que vous...
Thank you. Will you then be making a recommendation as to updating the IT system that would mean that at any point a person would be able to know who would have accessed a member's file?
Be something certainly welcome. The problem, of course, is effectively how that would be rolled out. So as an example, in a Naval Reserve Division, you have a ship's office, which is our administrative cell, and they handle all those things in terms of the personal files, the administration of a member. You could integrate perhaps some means of allowing members to access that information. I would just imagine the department would probably provide an excuse and say, we'll add it to our list of 100 to-dos, and by the time next century we've all forgotten about it, we'll take it off and no one will notice.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. There are a number of recommendations that were sent to us, Mr. White. Recommendations that you've made. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Perhaps you can tell us a bit more. For instance, the destruction of files when a person retires. Can you tell us what are we talking about specifically, and why do you consider this a recommendation to keep files for a longer period?
Part of the concern is members can use retirement to escape justice. I believe there was a case in CFB Halifax where an officer was placed under a harassment investigation, resigned from the military, and started work as a civilian the next day, to which point the military threw up its hands and said, well, I guess the matter's closed, the member's released. Having access to information that allows us to dig into the files of people who have retired means that we're not in a situation where important decisions are made, members are then able to release from the forces, and their emails are destroyed or other documents. I was just very surprised that the problem, of course, again, is that the system relies on an honor system. So if I come up with a list of 5 names, and in the process of filing that request, they go to those 5 people and one is retired, they throw up their hands and say, well, the member's retired, we can't get the records. So you're telling me the day after retired, we have no backups, we have nothing saved, no one's able to be like, oh, wait, hang on, the IT team didn't actually delete their records, that's scheduled for next week. If there is records worth preserving, that should be an obligation of members before they're released, is to ensure that they're properly preserved, or we need appropriate backup systems in this case. And the things that in my mind, when I say that specifically, could be emails, other drafts and correspondence, because honestly, you can rely on what's on the page, but the real decisions are probably hidden in emails or correspondence.
Merci beaucoup. Je sais que j'ai pas beaucoup de
Thank you very much. I know I don't have much time left, but maybe we'll get to it in the next round. But one of the recommendations you've made was to suspend the timeline for the tabling of a complaint, including a grievance, if an access to information was done, and communicating that would be useful to the drafting of the complaints. I understand it may go to the next round of questions, but I'd like to hear about this timeline for complaints and when they would lapse.
I'm sure you want to answer that in a fulsome way, and Ms. Normandy will have further time. Ms. Mattson, 6 minutes.
I too want to thank both witnesses for appearing today, and Mr. White, certainly I want to acknowledge the strength that you bring to this study and all that you do, and I truly appreciate that. Mr. Walburn, your breadth of experience is something very important to this committee as well. So I'm grateful for that here today. Mr. White, you referenced often, of course, the story that came forward in the Ottawa Citizen about Officer X. The internal report from the Integrated Complaint and Conflict Management Team found, and again you referenced this as well, that they had bundled the information and all those allegations up. It was over 14 years of multiple allegations. But no action, despite all of that, no action had been taken. And it wasn't until that was leaked, all that information was leaked to the media, that we knew about that. You also talked about that connection between transparency and accountability. So can you elaborate a bit more on that, but also the recommendations that you specifically have to ensure justice throughout all of this for survivors?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you as well for even raising and proposing the study. I was glad to see that someone had picked up the torch at the National Defense Committee, because certainly there's been a lot to talk about in this study for it. Recommendations, I mean, I certainly don't wish to hold myself out as more of an expert or holding more value than I can, but I will say that my experience, as you've seen from my remarks, has been very broad. I've touched on a lot of different offices. I've run into a lot of different barriers, and I've basically been fighting as long as it took the entirety of the Second World War. So, it's, well, the comparison isn't a flattering one for our current forces. But I would say that in terms of transparency, I mean, fundamentally, this comes down to accountability. I believe that while we can take some of the expertise that Mr. Walburn has and implement recommendations, and will continue to evolve and do that over time, at a fundamental level, I think the military has a lot of what it needs to solve its problems. The one thing it doesn't have is accountability of senior leadership. Senior leadership,
Internal will.
and that's where the accountability would come from. Yeah. is we have codes of ethics where when you don't respect the dignity of all persons, you can be released. I struggled to try to find the name of a single senior member of the forces who has been held accountable for anything other than their own personal conduct. In other words, has anyone been relieved of command for the 2,000 sexual assaults that occurred in the last year or the year before that? We're still dealing with these problems 8 years after Operation Honor. And as I told people, when you look at the facts, is I don't believe the issues that may have happened regarding General Vance happened because he was acting alone. There was a group of people who may have been signing travel claims. There may have been people who knew about it. As I said, people, you want to change the culture? You change the culture by making people more afraid of doing wrong than doing right. That's the current state of affairs.
Mr. White, so in the beginning of this study, Deputy Minister Bill Matthews came before the committee, and he stated that one of the biggest problems that we had in terms of the ATIP system was, and that timing of it and releasing of information was because the records weren't digital, and that they were working on that. But you've suggested that with even the deletion of an email when someone retires or a change within that system, that there are quite a lot of things lost. Should we be concerned about that with that movement towards a digitization?
The digitization may help, I think, speed up parts of the requests. And if you're able to digitize and store records so that individuals no longer need to provide them themselves. I mean, again, the process is you make a request. It goes to the corporate secretary and the ATIP team. They figure out where it needs to go. They blast it out. And then individual record holders are supposed to search their emails and provide search terms. I know because I've included my name in one of my own requests to see how that process would unravel. And I tell you, they ask for what search terms did you enter. So, for example, when you're looking for, I don't know, as a public example, Mark Norman, but you've never used Mark Norman's name in an email, Mark Norman's emails related to Mark Norman are not going to come up in that response. So one possible solution to part of the problem is that if the department tracks what terms are searched, who is solicited for a response, could we not make that available to requesters to provide their own degree of accountability and oversight? Because the documents that I've requested in my case and the cases of the related issues you've heard today, all of those things I requested as a double check. I requested a copy of the police report to see who was interviewed as a witness. They didn't interview the commanding officer who was present at the time. So that's an example of how you need to request these records so you can hold the system accountable. The same way that when you get your grades back in a school assignment, you might want to check your teacher's math because we're human. We make mistakes.
And Mr. Bazan, beginning of the 5-minute round, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both Mr. Walver and Mr. White for being here today and for your opening comments and testimony so far. This government came to power, just Trudeau campaigned on being the most transparent government in history. Yes or no? Do you think that the government has become more transparent?
It's a broad question, to be honest, but I can say that at least how it's trickling through the Department of National Defense is what's transparent are the problems.
I would have to ask as compared to what?
Compared to, well, they said it was going to get better. Has it got better or got worse?
Well, I can only speak from a personal perspective. I would absolutely say it's gotten worse.
Okay.
I went through a process at the end of my career that wasn't pretty, and I referenced it in my opening comments. And I suggest you go back and look at the transcript. There were about 8 or 10 people involved in that whole, I got to be careful here, I'm too old to be sued. There were 8 or 10 people involved in that situation that, without an exception, to the person, every one of them was promoted. No one was ever challenged on the actions that they took and the part that they played in this scenario. And everyone, without exception, was promoted.
Mr. Walburn, in your opening comments, you talked about a common pattern. You had 5 things listed as a common pattern, multiple ombudsmen. When we look at the situation with the former Chief of Defense Staff, John Vance, and you took that to Minister Sagen at the time, did that follow the same pattern as what you'd experienced and your predecessor experienced up to that point in time?
It got worse. As an ombudsman, part of your role is to advise the minister and seek guidance on files that cannot be solved at the lower level. And you've got to go to the minister with issues that are, sadly, a few of them end of life. But if you can't get into the minister, if you get shut down, the doors are closed, and someone on staff can refuse the ombudsman a meeting with the minister, and it happened consistently after that episode. So it not only did the pattern stay the way it was, lather, rinse, repeat, which I witnessed for 4.5 years, it got progressively worse after that.
So, Mr. Walborn, when currently, where the current system works is the Deputy Minister, the Defense Ombudsman, and the Judge Advocate General report directly to the Minister, that they are order and council appointments. So the government is proposing in Bill C-66 of adding to that list the Provost Marshal General, the Director of Military Prosecutions, and the Director of Defense Counsel will also become order and governor and council appointments, and they will also report to the minister. Now, you've long advocated, as well as your successor, Mr. Lick, that the Ombudsman Office should become a fully independent office, reporting to Parliament, being properly resourced to remove political interference. Do you believe that having more people report to the minister circumvents, as Mr. White laid out, the chain of command covering up for each other and no accountability, or does it open the door for more political interference?
In my opinion, it absolutely opens the door for more interference. If we put them in the same position, and you say on paper who reports to the minister, I had to go hat in hand to the deputy minister in order to get money, in order to get authority to do staffing. So if we put them into the same situation, I don't know how, in what world you think you're increasing transparency if you start bringing everyone into the House and putting them under the same set of rules. I just think it's going to get worse, not better.
Mr. White, you made 11 recommendations when you appeared before the Ethics Committee. Those 11 recommendations still stand?
I would say for the most part, they certainly do. I'm certainly following some of the feedback and the testimony that's come out of the previous meetings here, and understanding that, again, the government had rejected an accelerated process for sexual misconduct victims and survivors requesting information. But I think that at the end of the day, I would want to have heard in the deputy's response, which I did not hear in his defense of that rejection, that information that might come into play in a court setting, if there's a statute of limitations or a limitation period or some court timeline that cannot be amended, are you going to tell a sexual misconduct survivor or victim who has to give a victim's impact statement that, I'm sorry, we just process everything and all the ATIPs we get in order? So I think to your specific question, if the committee thinks they're relevant.
That, knowing that we down the road here are going to be studying Bill C-66, which is changes to the military justice system. Both of you have extensive experience, unfortunately, from a negative standpoint with military justice and the way it's been carried out. Would you be prepared to appear as witnesses on Bill C-66 as well?
If Parliament passes.
It has to come to committee.
Well, I'm sure you'll put forward that request. Ms. Lambropoulos. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you to both of our witnesses for being here, for your testimony, for, I know that you're both here to make the system better, and I appreciate that. My questions are going to go to Mr. White. You said something that I found quite interesting. Actually, your whole testimony was eye-opening, interesting, unfortunate. And one of the things that stood out to me was you said that in order to change the culture, you have to make people more afraid of doing wrong than of doing right. And I think that one of the big things here, and one of the reasons why justice isn't really served within the military, is because people are afraid of coming out, of complaining, of, and I know it's gotten better. I think the complaints have increased because people have heard that there are going to be changes that are going to be made. Have those actually happened? Not yet, from what I'm hearing. I'm wondering, if you can kind of explain a little bit further why people are afraid and what are the consequences that could be placed against someone, because I'm kind of new to, the idea of that. So if you could just express that.
As I stated before the Ethics Committee when the question of reprisals came up, reprisals can be varied, they can be numerous, they can come in many forms, and they can be very often hard to detect. Where there is discretion, where there is command authority, where there are opportunities to decide things, that is where the root of these abuses of power can exist. And as I said, fundamentally, we're dealing with an accountability abuse of power problem. So, for example, you might complain about something, and then all of a sudden, that posting you really wanted and might have been the most qualified for it, well, that's a discretionary decision, and command has gone a different direction. It could have been the emails and attacking my credibility that I've experienced, for example. The challenge is there's supposed to be the ethos, the military ethos, the code of ethics that is supposed to make people feel like they're doing shaming them and feeling like they're doing wrong when they step outside the code. But the problem is the incentive structure of the forces. If you're choosing a career-long, a career in the forces, a lifelong career, you risk not being promoted. You risk being thrust aside. You miss all kinds of opportunities. And so the incentives could be, I'm just going to keep quiet. I'm just going to keep my head down, do what the boss wants until I'm the boss. And then maybe I could nudge the ball forward on things. And so I could answer the question for an hour, but I'll stop there.
And I think that exists in most organizations, unfortunately. What do you think needs to change? What can actually change in order, you said people need to be more afraid of doing wrong than right. Can you give us an example of what exactly would allow that to happen?
The short answer is we need to move from a system of whistleblower reprisals to a system of whistleblower protections. I would like to highlight on the record, when I said I've been fighting this for 5.5 years, for those who might take issue with the manner in which I've communicated certain information today, I'd like to know why at any point in the last 5.5 years this couldn't have been dealt with by all the command authority that exists within the Royal Canadian Navy. So part of it would be to encourage people in a similar position to feel as though there is trust and confidence that issues will be looked at or solved. They could be brought in and explain things. I find a big problem is that the military doesn't want to talk. I mean, we've covered 5.5 years of issues effectively in, it's been 30 minutes so far, maybe? So why hasn't anyone really bothered to pick up the phone and call people and say, let's talk about these issues so that everyone gets buy-in rather than just the decisions communicated and there it is? That's fundamentally what we need so that, again, the military and the chain can be given a chance to do the right thing. And that when people feel like an outsider for doing the wrong thing, we'll know we've succeeded.
I see the bells, so I don't know if you want to maybe ask.
No, those aren't bells.
They stopped?
No,
Okay.
that's just the House is suspended at the
Okay.
call of the chair.
So can I continue?
We can proceed. No, we can carry on.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
30 seconds.
Okay. So I guess the last thing I would just want to say is I think it's crazy that Officer X has been promoted after 14 years of history with sexual misconduct. I don't know who that is, obviously, but when things like this happen, what do you think that says about the culture?
Too much to answer in 30 seconds. As I said, I think fundamentally you need leadership to lead. And my father, before he died, had gifted me a plaque that he had on his desk at work, and it says, if you're ahead of me, lead. If you're behind me, follow. And if you're not going to do anything, get the hell out of the way.
Title to the study.
Although I did like the proposal for "It's Not Our First Rodeo." I did find that was quite good.
Competing titles. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur White. J'aimerais.
Thank you, Mr. White. I'd like to hear you about the statute of limitations issue, if you can.
I think to add to that is part of the concern that I think was missing from the officials' presentation about grievances, again, is when I think it was one of the generals who had responded by saying that, well, there's a catch-all that says that if you exceed the timeline to file a grievance, of course, it can still be accepted. But it's a discretionary decision. It is not a mandatory meet these 5 guidelines and we will accept your grievance late. So if you have, again, bad actors in the system who are abusing their authority or just don't want to do the right thing or don't want to err on the side of hearing a grievance or entertaining a grievance, they can shut those things down. So that was part of why I had proposed the idea to say, look, I mean, we have these notice of intent to grieve, we have the grievance timelines, and I've run up, particularly in the Naval Reserve, they seem very, very strict when it suits them to shut down a grievance and then say, well, you could have done this, you could have done that. So I think the goal is to try to encourage members at almost like an intervention at an early stage, that if a member has everything that they need, they can proceed with the grievance. And to finish the thought, the grievance clock starts at the time of the decision, because that's what you have to grieve, the decision. So if it takes 6 months to get an access to information request related to the decision, well, I'm sorry, you've exceeded your 90 days. Now, again, a reasonable initial authority might look at that and say, you've made the argument that this was essential information to filing a grievance, I'll allow it. And others may say, you know, I don't think that's relevant, and throw it out because it's easy. And I also want to highlight a last point, which is it seemed very flippant almost to hear that the final authority can act as the catch-all solution when, one, the final authority has no maximum time limit to consider requests. But why are we saying it's okay to have a botched or invalid initial authority decision? That's like saying, well, we're going to let you go to court. The trial judge is totally going to butcher it, but don't worry, you can appeal. You've denied a first opportunity for review in which it would also have solved the problem much quicker. How is that an acceptable outcome?
Thank you.
Makes me think of the Trump trials. Ms. Madison.
Thank you. Mr. Walburn, you mentioned in your opening statement that you are highly supportive of my bill, Bill C-362, of which I am very, very grateful. It means a lot. It was because of listening to a few ombudsmen on this issue that I put that forward. That replacement or that creation of a truly transparent office for the CAF and D&D ombudsman is the main thrust of that bill, of course. But that independence could play such a key role. But how do you believe that independence, like what specifically, what tools could help in terms of making the military more accountable to things like a culture change?
Well, I liken it back to when they set up the Sexual Response Center. We learned very quickly when it was rolled out that it reported in through the chain of command to the Chief of Defense Staff and then functionally in through the Deputy Minister. There was a lot of reluctance for members who had experienced this type of behavior to come forward because there was no thought of independence. It can't be just independence, it also has to be perceived that it's independent. When people look at, especially people who have been aggrieved, they all automatically have a mistrust in the system. And if they think that their concern is not going to be taken seriously and outside the chain of command where it can have a full evaluation, it can be determined on its merits where it should go, then there's a reluctance to come forward. And I think by not having that thought that, hey, this person is not tied into the department, though they report through and help and assist the department, they have an option other than having to respond always to the one entity. I think it gives the members, especially this feeling that, hey, there's something I can do, there's somewhere I can go, there's a voice that will hear me, and it's not going to be restricted by any schematic that has been set up by the department. So I just think it goes to transparency and perception of transparency.
And you said it before, you said it again today about ombudsmen shouldn't, or listening to them shouldn't come down to personalities. Do you believe that independence would be key to ensuring that your work, your successors' work didn't come down to, and the implementation of those recommendations come down to personalities, or is there more?
I think it opens up a venue where the concerns will be heard by a broader audience. It doesn't come down to an ombudsman going hat in hand looking for some money. I just think it changes the ground. It makes it different for everybody who would use the office.
Thank you, Ms. Matson. Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Yes, to the former ombudsman. From the time you gave your testimony on how the military addresses sexual misconduct cases within its ranks till now, have you seen any improvement made by DND or CAF?
I think there's been incremental improvement. I think it would be unfair to say they haven't tried to do their best. I do believe, I think as Patrick has said, there has been some acceptance in the environment where people feel that, yeah, we can come forward a bit more. I don't know if we've gotten down to the ground on this yet. I do believe it's going to be a work in progress for a period of time. The current setup and structure seems to be helping along those lines. And I don't think you're going to swallow an elephant. You'll have to eat it one bite at a time. So I think there has been some incremental improvement. I think there's an option for people there, and I think it's being received somewhat in a fairly good light.
So during your time as ombudsman, were there any reports of reprisals from DND or CAF superiors when a service member requested an ATIP?
Absolutely.
And what sorts of reprisals are the same type that we're hearing from Mr. White?
Absolutely.
How should service members be protected from reprisals from their superiors when they request an ATIP?
Well, each case in and of itself is different. Some of these things are very minor issues that need to be dealt with. It was a clerical error, and some of them are, you would almost think that it was a planned way forward not to release the information. So each and every case was different. It would depend on the circumstances of the case. People just not being given the information, being accused of using the wrong search when you ask for someone by name and they're only referred to by rank. So those are the types of things. The Ombudsman did have the opportunity to squeeze some of that information out of the department to help the constituent move forward.
So ATIP seems to be a very inefficient way of, for a person to obtain the information they need. Are other areas in the public service required to go through the same process to find the documents they need for their cases, as they may be?
Once an ATIP request comes in, anyone who's mentioned on that has to be engaged. The writer of some of this information also has the privilege to say, no, I don't want it released.
But is there a process, aside from ATIPs, because this is obviously broken, where an employee can or a service member can obtain the documents they need without going through that system? Is there another way to do it?
Well, it depends which documents they're looking for. If they're looking for access to the personnel record, that's fairly easily done. But it would depend on what documents they were searching for.
In terms of legal records, for example, copies of reports of testimonies when somebody is originally making a report after a sexual assault. Is that something that they have to ATIP? Should they just be able to get it? Do they need to retain a lawyer to obtain the documents?
Yes to all of the above. Again, not to be flip, but it does depend. If it's something that has to do with the member's personnel file, it will be on their file, should be on their file. If it is something to do with an accusation of inappropriate behavior or sexual misconduct, or whatever that may be, that may not be captured on a personnel file, and it would end up being an ATIP request. There's not many other ways to get access to that information.
So there, at one point along the way, there was a duty to report any sexual assaults. And here the individual did report that was in trouble for doing that. Is there another way to ensure, aside from going outside the military, that instances such as this can be addressed in a proper and timely manner?
Look, I think it comes back to what Patrick has already said. We need to talk about accountability. And if we keep rewarding poor behavior, we're going to get the poor behavior. So I think, this is an accountability issue. I would say, you ask me, in my jaded old age, I would say it all should be outside of the military chain of command, these types of things. That's not going to happen. So what is another option for us? The Ombudsman, even when the Sexual Response Center was set up, we still continue to deal with inappropriate sexual behavior complaints. So it depends, this duty to report, I think we need to allow the victims to determine what their self-actualization looks like. What do I want to do and how do I want to do it? It shouldn't be someone else reporting in on you. So there's a lot in that. So
Were Were there other reprisals, such as Mr. White has experienced in obtaining the access to information reports?
Absolutely.
So this is business as usual.
Absolutely.
So still told, we should be entitling this not their first rodeo, Mr. Chairman.
We'll take that under advisement. Mr. Collins, 5 minutes.
Sorry. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to both of the witnesses. Terrific testimony. Mr. Walburn, you know, I've been in public life for many, many years, and I have found that when you deal with problem areas of an organization, sometimes it takes someone such as yourself to shine the light on a problem, to try to raise awareness and create healthy tension to implement change. And I have found that over the years where there's pushback, sometimes it requires policy changes, as you've suggested and highlighted here today, as has Mr. White. Sometimes it requires a change in personnel in terms of leadership that just doesn't want to buy in. Sometimes it's gone on for so long in an area of an organization that it's embedded in the organization. And I think, to use Ms. Matheson's term earlier, you need culture change, wholesale culture change. So you've been at this for a number of years. Most would point to you and say that you're an expert in this field. When you've implemented the policy changes and you've changed leadership, or you've done both, and you still haven't found that change, what are the next steps?
I think we've talked around it a little bit here today. It's got to be developing a system where we reward proper behavior and we punish inappropriate behavior. When I talked about my own personal case, there were 8 or 10 people involved in that scenario. Every one of them got promoted. So what do you think their underlings now look at as the proper way to get moved ahead in the organization? You know, he talks about inside the military chain of command that, well, discretionary, didn't get the posting. And then he sees how that, you know, his colleague sees how that works. When he gets in a chance to be in a place of command or obtain something for their benefit, they're going to use the same behavior. It's, you know, we all talk about culture change and we're going to change the culture. We go on ad nauseum about it. But what do? We don't go after what's causing the culture to be broken, which is the behavior of individuals in the culture. So unless we want to weed those people out and start rewarding proper behavior and punishing bad behavior, then we can talk about culture till the cows come home, but it's not going to change.
Thank you for that. And we've seen that culture change happen in other areas. You know, I'll point to the entertainment industry as a great example. Amateur sports, I think we've made strides here in Canada in terms of encouraging people to report. And Mr. White, you talked about encouraging people to report and the reprisals that came with trying to seek out more information, right? The more information we have when there's an investigation, the better opportunity we have to pass judgment on those who have done something wrong. Can you talk about the importance of having a system in place that allows people and encourages people actually to proactively report wrongdoing when they see it?
I mean, I think the basics of the system exist. Really what the system, I would say, that needs to be fixed is the people system, the people version of that system, which is making sure that when you come and report to someone that they're willing to take it. I mean, look, my interpretation of a lot of the obligations of superior officers is that if a subordinate came to me and had reported wrongdoing and I reported to my boss and I was not satisfied that my boss was going to do the proper thing, I actually would have an obligation, not an option, not a chance, but an obligation to take that further. In my particular case, I'm the most junior member, the person who is victimized in this sort of situation, and I've had to fight every step of the way when I know that is, as I've given you the names of all the commanding officers and superior officers who have knowledge of this. Why is it being driven by those individuals? So in terms of a system, what is severely lacking is effectively an internal champion or people who wouldn't be punished for saying, I respectfully disagree with the boss's opinion, I need to go talk to their boss. It's seen inherently as insubordination.
Can I just add to that?
Absolutely,
You asked why Hollywood and athletics, how it's changed. It's changed because the public spotlight got shown on it. That's why it's changed. It's not changed because we allowed an internal unit inside either one of those entities to report upon itself. That's not how it changed. It changed because the public became outraged about the behavior. And that's how it changed. And why did it become outraged? Because it became public knowledge. It got put above the tabletop and said, here it is in its ugly truth. Let's deal with it.
Sure. 30 seconds. Well, hard for me to ask a question and get an answer in 30 seconds, but I'll reiterate my opening comments. You've given terrific testimony here today, and I agree with Mr. Bazan in terms of having you back when the legislation is back here. You've provided a lot of information for us to think about, and I appreciate the fact that you've taken time out of your day to do so.
That completes our second round. Colleagues, I propose we go to a third round. We have the room for 2 more hours ultimately. So, yeah. The bells aren't ringing, so we're not worried about that for the time being. We'll commence the next 5-minute round with Mr. Bazan, and I just say the Conservatives, I need a person for the final question. Mr. Kelly? Okay. And the and the Liberals, Ms. Lalonde. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Bazan.
Thank you. So, we're talking about culture, we're talking about cover-up, and one witness on the study already said that there's a culture of over-classification at National Defense, so that they don't have to release it. They can hide it behind secret and top secret. And we've already mentioned the use of code names, like when Admiral Norman was described or referred to as the Kraken, although some may say that that is the common code name used for the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. But regardless, it does, and then on top of that, as you've experienced, Mr. White and Mr. Walborn, that they then rag the puck when it comes down to slowly trickling out information under ATIPs and even requests for papers coming from committee. They take their sweet time about it. So what can we do to change that culture and provide the checks and balances to ensure that there is accountability in leadership of both the Canadian Armed Forces side and the department side to ensure that access to information is released in a timely manner? How do we fix this? You guys have both been on the inside.
Look, not to repeat myself, but let me repeat myself. We're talking about people who have been put in positions of authority. There are guidelines on what they're supposed to do. They're well written. When I first joined the public service after a long stint in the private sector, should have stayed there. But when I came into the public sector, what I was given was a binder about this sick, and it didn't tell me just about how I should behave. It told me how I should dress, what I should do with my family. It was like a binder of about 200 pages of how an executive should present themselves. And in that, we talked about ethics and being accountable, understanding the law, doing the right thing. And it was an ethos. I said, well, what a place. Let's rock and roll here. But it's funny, the higher you get up the ladder, the thinner the ear gets. I'm sure that's what happens. And the blood rushes to their heads or their egos. But we have a system in place. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We have the Public Service Disclosure Act if someone wants to blow the whistle on something. But we see that as system abused. We have an ATIP process that is supposed to follow a step-by-step logical format in order to release information. It's not followed. It's circumvented by people in the system. So how do we change the culture? I'll go back to it again. We've got to start rewarding proper behavior and punishing bad behavior. Why do we promote people when they do the wrong thing? And others who come forward and offer themselves up to say, listen, guys, this is what's going wrong. Can we get a little help here? Those people are turned upon. You absolutely have a fundamental flaw here, but it's not with your policies. Your policies need updating. Sure, they do. And you need to adjust a few and add a few things to it and bring in a few more nuances and codicils on there. But what we have to get at is the behavior of the people who are currently sitting in the seats. You know, I read the transcripts of about Mr. Matthews when he was here, and he was asked a question about the Ombudsman. Well, we have no control over the Ombudsman's office. And then in the next statement, well, we're thinking about loosening up some of the controls. Those two comments don't make sense. How is it you have no control, but you're going to loosen the controls? So it's one or the other. So we don't challenge people when they do things that are inappropriate and use and manipulate the rules and regulations in place to suit their needs. I just think we've got to get back to that.
So would you agree, both of you, that it's a sad state of affairs when the Information Commissioner actually has to take the Department of National Defense and the Minister of National Defense to court?
Absolutely. And it was a sad state of affairs when I had to challenge the minister publicly to get information on the transition process of the Canadian Armed Forces. So here we go yet again. So it's not like, oh, this just happened yesterday. This is pattern behavior. And if we allow it to continue, we'll be having this conversation. Patrick will be my age when we come back the next time. God bless you. So
I like your hair, but
took me an hour. But if we don't go after the people who are in position and challenge them to do the right thing, teach them how to do the right thing, and reward them for doing the right thing, everyone at D&D in the executive cadre is getting a bonus this year. I guarantee you.
I'll let you get in on this, but you know there is an ethos, right? There is the code of service discipline. There are the KR and O's now, but you know they are supposed to describe how our leadership within the Canadian Armed Forces is supposed to act. And yet the ones at the top are the ones in your experience, and others are they're the ones that are ignoring it.
Let me quote from the privacy breach report that I received from the department that said what they were basically in mitigation. 25.
Very briefly, because Mr. Bazan has blown through his time quite nicely.
Understood. 25 August 2023, Member B was reminded that according to Section 7 use of the Privacy Act, the use of personal information must be consistent with the purpose for which it was collected, and that retention of performance-related information must be in accordance with current systems, policies, and standards. The punishment for breaking the Privacy Act is being reminded what's in the Privacy Act?
Thank you for that reminder. Ms. Lalonde.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you to Mr. Walborn for your service to our CAF and their family. Lieutenant, I would certainly like to hear a little bit more from you, and I will reflect on a bill, C-66, that the Military Justice Modernization Act, that the government proposed to increase the independence of the military justice actor like Provost Marshal to ensure that they are not influenced by the chain of the command. I would like to hear your thoughts, actually, on the importance of the importance of the independence of the military justice actors, but also the role that the chain of command can play in the system today at present.
Well, thank you for the question. First, I would say that I haven't actually brushed up too much on the military justice system itself, as you heard that mentorship was the response from the recommendation by the military police for charges. So I haven't actually gotten to the trial phase. I would just say that, I mean, in my corporate law practice, we deal with issues of fiduciary duties of directors, and that there are stockholders who can appoint directors to the board of a company, but that the director themselves, regardless of their affiliation with the stockholder, must act in the best interest of the corporation. So the appointment process itself doesn't necessarily mean that an individual is in a conflict of interest if there is a very strict code of ethics and there is enforcement of that code. A breach of fiduciary duties is a cause of action in court of law. So a director that breaches those duties can be personally liable for individual breaches. And so that means that if they're acting inappropriately, they can be held accountable by other stockholders, or they can be held accountable by other actors who have been harmed. The same principle can apply here. So I will say that I did read with interest an assessment of Bill C-66 by someone in the profession, much more expertise than me, Rory Fowler, a well-known name, I believe. And I think to his point is that I'm not sure that changing the appointment process is truly going to fix issues of independence when you could in fact empower someone either with positive reinforcement or the negative reinforcement that comes by clearly laying out ethical issues. In other words, if they had received pressure from, let's say, the Chief of Defense Staff to act inappropriately, if they had a reporting mechanism themselves, an ethical obligation to resist that sort of pressure, they could be supported, and there would be no need to change that appointment process. But again, I will qualify that I have not brushed up too much on that aspect of the military justice system.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Actually, I really appreciate. We might have brushed up a little bit that questions, but I certainly would like to know that, as I said, thank you for your service, and I know you're still in the forces. How has your experience with the Canadian Armed Forces grievance system affected your ability, or I would say your willingness to continue to serve? Have you spoken to individuals in a similar situation as yours?
The grievance system is presently almost the bane of my existence. It is a source of aggravation, frustration. I mean, the problem is that you require members. So I'll say two things. First of all, I'll back by saying you need to put yourself in the perspective of the most vulnerable kind of person. Respectfully, that's actually not me. I'm an attorney. I have some legal knowledge. I'm not the most vulnerable kind of person. The most vulnerable kind of person may be the 16-year-old who gets parental consent to join. They may be the person who is so affected by aggravated sexual trauma that they can't even put their hand on the doorknob to get into work, or may vomit when putting on their uniform. Just as an example. If you design a system in mind so that individuals like that can navigate it, rather than requiring us to be a Rory Fowler or Michelle Drapeau, you will succeed in having a system that works for everyone. The grievance system as it stands requires individuals like myself and others to spend our limited part-time, our free time, to fight a system that is paid and employed full-time to fight back. That's the challenge I have. I am not an expert on military regulation, military law, et cetera, but they have access to all of those resources. They also have access to legal advice on those issues. Members don't. So the grievance system, and what annoys me more than anything, is that senior members who have never been affected in the way that some of us have flippantly just say, if you don't like it, grieve it, knowing full well that they've never had to go through those processes, or maybe they did in a minor way and had success. So all of these issues, again, if I could leave the committee with one final point to think about is, if you really want to get to culture change, you really want to solve these issues, you need to look at every single aspect of the system and understand how it feeds back in. Everything from the honors and recognition system, everything from the promotion system, the grievance system, the military police system, all of it. But all of it with a central view of what would the effect be on these sorts of things that we get to.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, colleagues. As you can see, the bells are ringing. They're 15-minute bells. Only with your permission can I squeeze out another 5 or 10 minutes. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, we're just upstairs. So
Yeah.
run up and vote.
Okay, so we'll give it another 10 minutes. Just to be fair, I guess we're going to have to go 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, and 2 minutes. Okay? There we go.
Yeah, it works. We can all get up there.
Okay, Ms. Normandin, 2 minutes.
Merci. Peut-être.
Thank you very much. A question for you, Mr. Walburn. You mentioned that it's only when the ombudsman issues recommendations that the media is shedding light on things that this moves forward. One of the recommendations is the ombudsman reporting directly to the House rather than to the minister. And what would your expectation be as to the role of members, specifically opposition members, if the ombudsman could report to the House rather than to the minister? What would be the role of opposition members in that context?
Well, as for the construct of how it would work, I mean, the ombudsman is still going to report through the minister. The work that's done inside of the CAF would have to come through that chain. If there is no response, where does it go from there? The corrections ombudsman right now reports through the minister. He goes to the commissioner. If there's no action, he goes to the minister. And if not, it goes from there to the House. It gets tabled, and there's light shone on it. How we want to do that at the end of the day, is it a committee? Is it taken to the House? I mean, I think those are details that need to be determined on the best way forward. There are several options. If we look at the 5 Eyes, they have various applications of this. So I think there are ways of doing it, but I think it would remain on what's the capacity and where should it go. That's how I'd like to see it reviewed.
I still have a little bit of time. Mr. White, on the recommendations for disciplinary and administrative sanctions for people who don't create files or destroy files, wouldn't there be a risk for people that are lower on this?
Is a good question in the sense of there's always an opportunity, as I was saying, when you have issues for discretion where abuse can arise. When it comes to requesting information, I mean, the challenge, of course, is that assumptions are made as to who's making these sorts of requests, and actions can be taken appropriately. I'm very certain, and from what you hear from oral history, that for example, in the Naval Reserve headquarters, meetings about me and my issues are dealt with verbally. They even go a step further, not just destroying records, they don't create them. They don't send emails. They'll send a text message that can't be ATIP. They'll make phone calls. And so it's...
Mr. White, I'm sorry to interrupt
lots
you.
of opportunity
As you
for
can
abuse.
see, we're running here.
Understood.
Ms. Madison, 2 minutes.
In a couple months, Mr. Lick will be retiring from his role as ombudsman. We're in mid-April. I had asked him, he is certainly very concerned in the fact that still no job poster is up on PCO website for his replacement.